The plane was falling, and it was a mess. But there was only one good parachute left in the whole plane. In that crazy moment, Jessica gave me, Tom, that last parachute. I landed okay, but my stepbrother, Luke, my dad's son from another woman, died in the crash. After we were found, Jessica still wanted to marry me, like we planned. We had a big, fancy wedding. But 6 years after we got married, she still blamed me. She thought I was the reason Luke died. She treated me like her enemy. And those 6 years were awful, full of pain. Finally, when we were getting divorced, she wanted us both to die at the spot where Luke had died. But when I woke up, I was back on the plane, on the day of the crash. This time, I decided to give the chance to live to the person she loved the most. When I knew I was back in time, the plane was already shaking badly. The flight attendants were giving out parachutes, but when they got to me and Luke, they found out that one parachute was broken. After a few seconds of thinking, Jessica still gave me the last good parachute. Tom, this parachute is for you. Seeing the hurt on Jessica's face as she gave me the last parachute, I stepped back and said no. No, thank you. Jessica, save Luke first. This time, I wasn't going to be responsible for someone else's life. I wanted to live for myself. When I said that, Jessica seemed relieved. She looked at me, her worried face relaxed, and she even sounded a little happy. She quickly pulled Luke to her and put the last parachute on him. Tom, you're my fiancé. I should have saved you first, but since you asked me to save Luke, I will. With that, she immediately pulled Luke toward the plane's exit and jumped. She didn't even look at me again, like she was scared I would change my mind. It was silly. Did she think everyone was like her? It was her decision, but after being rescued, she regretted it. In my first life, she gave me the last parachute, then stayed by my side after I jumped, leaving Luke alone on the plane. Even though we called for help as soon as we landed, in the huge sky, Luke's body was never found. When Jessica first heard about Luke's death, she didn't react, not even to me. She just said coldly, he was just an unimportant person. She even took care of all of Luke's things by herself while I was grieving. Her only request was not to leave him buried alone, and she suggested Luke be buried in the Miller family cemetery, where there was an empty spot. I agreed right away, even asking if she wanted to wait to get married. But what did she say? She took my hand, looking at me with love in her eyes. Tom, marrying you is what I've always wanted. We can't wait because of someone unimportant, can we? You know, I've waited for this day for so long. I thought she really loved me, that she wanted to be with me forever, but later I found out she only married me quickly to make me suffer, to make me pay for Luke's death. However, that choice wasn't something I forced on her, or something I made her do. So, what did Luke's death have to do with me? This time, I gave the chance to live to the one she loved most. She should be thanking me. Watching them jump and disappear, I immediately started thinking of how to save myself. After all, this time, I couldn't be sure that Jessica would remember to call for help after she was safe. In both lives, Jessica's heart had always belonged to my stepbrother, Luke. In my first life, even though there was little hope, she still called for help as soon as we had a phone signal. But this time it was Luke who had the parachute, the chance to live. So I couldn't even hope that she would call for help right after jumping. If she didn't announce that I was dead, I would be very lucky. After all, in both lives, the person Jessica loved was Luke. In the first life, I only found out after we married that Jessica and Luke had known each other for a long time. They went to the same school, both known as the illegitimate children of their families, and because of that, they understood each other and promised to always be together. Even our engagement was because I was the heir to the Miller family, the one who would inherit all of the Miller family's money. So even though she loved Luke in both lives, she chose to save me for the Miller family's money. But in my first life, Jessica really regretted choosing to save me for the money. Now, I had made a new choice for her, and she should be thankful. As I watched them disappear, I immediately ran to the cockpit. In the last life, guided by Jessica, I slowly started to feel responsible for the plane crash. I thought Luke's death was my fault, that I had taken his chance to live. So later, I learned how to fly, even getting a license, and watched many simulations of the crash. I asked many experts, but every time I showed the simulation to the instructors, their answers surprised me. There were many nights when I hoped to go back to this day. Now my wish had come true, and I felt very excited. Remembering what I learned in the last life, I fastened my seatbelt and started to slowly control the plane's descent. After all, the reason the plane was in this situation was because of the project in City A, where both the Miller and the Jones families were the most likely to win. In reality, the plane wasn't broken. It was just that the crew was hired by the other side, who had made up the whole thing. They had deliberately broken one parachute to make both families unstable, hoping to get the project in City A. But since I was back, I wouldn't let the tragedy of the past happen again. I sat in the cockpit, expertly turning the throttle back on, adjusting the controls. The engine roared back to life, and the plane, which had been falling fast, slowly stopped its dive. There was even a slight upward tilt, and with my careful adjustments, the plane's descent started to become stable. However, after the fast fall, the plane was now too low to reach the airport. It could only make an emergency landing. Luckily, below was not a city full of tall buildings, but wide mountains. I carefully controlled the plane's fall, watching as the plane passed over the mountain trees, knocking them down before gently landing in a valley between two mountains. When I stepped out of the cockpit and stood on the ground, I felt like I was a new person. However, the landing spot looked empty, with no sign of people, and there was no phone signal. In fact, there wasn't any signal at all. After trying many times to call the emergency number, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I gathered the remaining supplies from the plane and started walking toward the bottom of the mountain. But the path was dangerous. After just a few steps, I had several scratches from the wild grass. Seeing the blood on my ankle, I couldn't even wipe it off, and had to keep walking. Finally, not far down the path, I saw someone. I quickly called out, "Help! Wait, please, help me!" She heard me. She turned around. But as she turned, I froze. "Rachel!" When Rachel saw me, her eyebrows tightened, and she immediately walked toward me. Seeing the injuries on my body, there was a bit of worry in her eyes, though she quickly hid it. "What happened? How did you end up here alone?" I explained the situation as simply as I could. After hearing it, she sighed deeply. "Surviving something big often brings good luck. Let me take care of those cuts." Okay. I had thought that she would lead the way, but surprisingly, she gently supported me and guided me toward the car at the base of the mountain. My hand automatically went around her neck and rested on her shoulder, and the faint smell of roses from her body filled my senses. Feeling a little awkward, I spoke up. "Rachel, maybe you should lead the way. I can walk on my own." But Rachel only held me tighter. "It's fine. The mountain path is hard to walk." Seeing her insist, I didn't argue and let her guide me to the car, where she helped me into the passenger seat. She pulled out a small first aid kit from under the seat, took out some alcohol, and gently began to clean my wounds. "Does it hurt?" "No, it doesn't." Looking at her worried face, I gripped my arm with my right hand, trying my best not to cry. I remembered the last life, when Jessica and I had just married. At a company party, a group of people kept offering drinks, and I was worried that Jessica might drink too much, so I told her to slow down. She suddenly got angry and, in front of everyone, pushed me into the champagne tower when I wasn't expecting it. The champagne glasses fell down, and the glass shattered on the floor, with me falling into the broken pieces. The glass pieces cut into my skin, and blood mixed with the spilled wine covered my body. I cried out in pain, and only with the help of the staff did I manage to stand up, looking at her in disbelief. But her eyes showed no warmth, and her voice was cold. Does it hurt? It should. When Luke died, his body was destroyed. He hurt 1,000 times more, 1,000,000 times more. If it weren't for you, if you hadn't taken his parachute, he wouldn't have died. Tom Miller, it's all your fault. I stood there in front of everyone, taking her blame, letting her push me down. It was then that I realized Jessica and Luke had been deeply in love for a long time, and marrying me was just for her family's money. Ha ha ha. I laughed loudly at her, like she was a joke. Jessica, do you really think I caused all of this? The plane was sabotaged by your rivals, and they deliberately damaged one parachute. You didn't blame them, but you come here blaming me? You're crazy. After saying that, I turned and left, going alone to the hospital to treat my injuries. That was when my relationship with Jessica broke down completely. She started to put me down in every public place, but now, the sister who had grown up with me was careful not to hurt me, her hands gentle as she treated my wounds. I took a deep breath, trying to make my voice sound normal. Thank you, Rachel. Suddenly, Rachel looked up, grabbed my wrist, and stared at me seriously. Tom, you and Jessica may not be right for each other, but the Miller-Jones marriage can still happen. I stared at her, confused. Sister Rachel, what do you mean? But she suddenly let go of my hand, putting a painkiller in my palm, and not continuing the conversation. It's nothing. I'll take you home, okay? Honestly, I didn't want to go back home. My parents had an arranged marriage, a union of two powerful families that created me. But after I was born, each of them found their true love somewhere else. As for me, the child of their past marriage, they both agreed to leave the family money to me, but showed no interest in caring for me. As for Jessica, after we married in the previous life, she never once took me anywhere public as her husband. She never allowed me to touch her, and when people asked about me, she would sneer and make fun of me. Even after the company merger, she and those around me tricked me, taking away my shares. Because I loved her, I kept giving in, and in the end, I had no way out. So, looking at Rachel, who was focused on taking care of my wounds, I asked directly, I don't want to go back, Rachel. Can I stay with you for a few days? Seeing her silence, I gave her a pleading look, trying to look as sad and hurt as possible. In the last life, she had gone abroad shortly afterward, so we didn't have much contact. But when she found out I was getting a divorce, she came back to help me without hesitation. So, whether in this life or the last, she had always been someone who helped me. When she saw my sad expression, she suddenly lowered her head, her eyes burning as she looked at me. Are you sure living with me will come at a price? The sudden closeness made me instinctively step back, but I could still smell her unique rose scent, which made me feel a bit lightheaded. I'll pay any price. Really? Really? I looked at her with determination, and she suddenly smiled. For a moment, the air felt charged, and I thought we might kiss, but then she stepped back, messing up my hair. Remember what you said? Okay. But in the end, I still went back home. The car drove me along the way, but as we passed a gas station, Rachel, who was holding my hand and about to buy some food, ran into Jessica and her rescue team. Tom, it's really you. Are you okay? When Jessica saw me, her eyes flashed with disbelief, followed by a look of happiness. But I only gave her a cold look, keeping my hand firmly in Rachel's. What could have happened to me? Jessica stared at me in shock, seemingly not expecting me to survive the fall from so high up, but Luke, standing behind Jessica, saw Rachel behind me. Without hesitation, he stepped in front of Jessica and spoke. Tom, was it Rachel who saved you? But how did you survive that fall from so high up, and by some strange luck, end up meeting Rachel? Did you two already know each other? What was he trying to say? Did he think I planned all of this? And you know Rachel has been competing with Jessica for the Jones family money lately. What a coincidence that you two come out of the forest together. Tom, are you really going to say that none of this has anything to do with you? I took a deep breath and looked back at Luke. In my previous life, although Luke's body was never found, I had felt very guilty. Besides, even though he was only a few months younger than me, I had always treated him like a little brother. But now, it seemed like this brother didn't see me as his real family. Seeing that Luke was about to continue, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over to him and, under his accusing gaze, punched him right in the face. Smack! Luke immediately covered his face, staring at me in disbelief, and even Jessica beside him looked at me in shock. I casually blew at the imaginary dust on my hand. The world suddenly felt so quiet. It was wonderful. Then, with everyone still stunned, I raised my hand and turned to the police officer who had just arrived. Officer, I'd like to report this. He's spreading lies about me. And so, we were all taken to the police station. Luke called the police, saying that Rachel and I had planned the accident, while I, in turn, accused Luke of lying about us. After some back and forth, we were all brought in. While waiting to be questioned, Luke kept glaring at me, seemingly trying to get me to admit something. Tom, we're family. Jessica is your fiancée. Are you really that cold, wanting us both dead? I lowered my head, looking at the bandages on my foot, and ignored him. After a moment, I spoke coldly. Do you have any proof for all these words? You should know better than anyone what happens when you lie. I lifted my head and looked at him with icy eyes. Luke, have you forgotten what happened to the last person who lied about me? When I was in high school, someone was jealous of my good grades and spread rumors that I had cheated on my exams. The rumors spread quickly, and when my parents found out, they called the police, who arrested all the people involved. Some of them even tried to deny it, saying they had been forced. But as the police investigated, they all eventually admitted what they did. Luke's face immediately changed when he heard this. He stood there, silent, not wanting to say anything more. But Jessica, who had been listening to our conversation, was furious. She quickly pulled Luke behind her, glaring at me with disgust. Tom, what do you mean by that? The people who spread those rumors about you were already caught. Don't threaten Luke with such things. He was just saying what he thought. Is it really necessary for you to act like this? I gave her a cold look, with no emotion in my eyes. Since you're so sure, does that mean you were the one who planned my downfall back then? Jessica's face instantly turned pale, but years of experience kept her calm. She narrowed her eyes at me and replied with a cold sneer. Tom, talk with proof. I couldn't help but laugh. Now you want to talk about proof? Jessica, angry at my words, turned pale. Her voice got higher as she tried to respond, but before she could say anything more, Rachel walked out of the interrogation room. Seeing the scene, Rachel immediately stepped in front of me, looking powerful. Do you still want to make a move? I stood behind Rachel, smirking as I watched Jessica, who seemed to be completely flustered, looking at Rachel with a mix of anger and confusion. Rachel, I'm his fiancée! Is that so? Rachel deliberately turned to me, her icy gaze suddenly softening into a look filled with tenderness, her eyes seeming to shine. She's your fiancée? I quickly shook my head and answered without hesitation. No, of course not. Rachel chuckled lightly, her voice sounding attractive. She seemed carefree and relaxed, especially with the way her eyes sparkled. Her gaze made everything else disappear, and I found myself unable to think about anything except those soft, inviting lips. She must be using some kind of charm on me. Otherwise, why would I feel like I had to lean in and kiss her? Jessica, seeing this, felt the blood rush to her head. Her face turned several shades darker, and she glared at us with obvious hate. Just as she was about to explode, the police called me into the room to give my statement. Jessica had no choice but to stop. By the time all of us had been questioned, the police had a better idea of who the main suspects were. By the time we left the police station, it was already evening. I was holding Rachel's hand, slowly walking out through the main entrance. Just as I was about to get into Rachel's car, Jessica suddenly spoke up from the side. "Tom, your parents already know what happened today. They're really worried about you and are waiting for you at your house. Shouldn't you go check on them?" I couldn't help but laugh when I heard that. They were so worried about me that they didn't even bother to call and ask how I was doing. Instead, they just stayed at home, waiting for me. What a way to show they cared. Moreover, they had both already found their true loves. If it weren't for the prearranged deal to leave their money to me, they probably wouldn't even consider giving me anything. I couldn't help but smile sadly when I thought back to my childhood. When I was little, I didn't understand why they got divorced or why they didn't want to see me. In an effort to see them, I tried so hard to be the best, just to make them smile a little when they signed my report cards. I wanted even the smallest bit of love from them, but even that was nowhere near what they gave their new children. Eventually, I stopped hoping. I started celebrating my own achievements, whether it was getting the best score or buying myself a small cake on my birthday, just to mark the occasion. And it was during this time of my life that I met Jessica in college. Our families were longtime friends, and the marriage contract had been set up a long time ago, though the right partner had never been chosen. After my father divorced my mother, he immediately married Luke's mother, only to later claim to have found his true love. On the Jones side, after having Rachel, Mr. Jones had a child with another woman and named her Jessica. Though Jessica was an illegitimate child, she was still brought back to the family home and raised there. The marriage contract was supposed to be between Rachel and me, but when I went to university, Jessica began to aggressively pursue me. Having never experienced love before, I completely fell for her after days of intense pursuit. I believed she liked me, that she loved me. That's why I agreed to go through with the engagement with her, despite everyone else being against it. Even my parents seemed to prefer Jessica to me. They saw her as capable, smart. They thought that after I married her, she would take charge of everything, leaving me to focus on managing the family business. To them, that was their version of love for me. So, when I eventually asked for a divorce in my past life, they naturally refused. To them, my happiness didn't matter. What mattered was that the company was well managed. I also knew that after our marriage, it wouldn't be easy for the Jones-Miller families to divorce. So I endured for year after year, until, in the 6th year of our marriage, I finally got proof of Jessica's bad management. I presented the evidence to her, threatening her that I would file for divorce unless she agreed. But she... Now, in this new life, I was determined not to make the same mistakes again. I got into the car, glanced at Rachel in the passenger seat, and whispered, "Rachel, can I drive you home?" Rachel didn't refuse. I started the car, and as we neared her house, she handed me her phone. I looked at her, confused. She spoke, her voice having a subtle coldness. "Tomorrow I'll pick you up, and we'll go to the Jones family to discuss the marriage contract." I quickly entered my phone number, handed the phone back to her respectfully. "It's done, Rachel." Rachel parked the car neatly, then dialed my number. She waited for the sound of my phone ringing before opening the car door. "Go on. If you need anything, call me." "Okay, I will." After leaving the Jones family, I drove back home. As soon as I opened the front door, I saw my parents sitting on opposite ends of the couch, each of them silent, but the tension in the air was obvious. Before I could even take a step towards the sofa, my father immediately stood up and started scolding me. "You're already this old. How can you still act like this? Do you have any idea how much I've sacrificed today to wait for you? I turned down a multi-million-dollar business dinner just to be here. And you? Since when can you fly a plane? How come I didn't know about that?" In his anger, my father slammed his hand on the table, pointing at me, his voice rising. "Luke was only asking you a few questions at the police station, and you threatened him like that? Where's your sense of being an older brother? And what's going on with you and Rachel? Don't forget." Before my father could finish, my mother picked up a vase from the table and threw it at him. "David, what do you mean by that? How dare you criticize Tom over a child that's not even part of the family?" David, stunned by the broken vase on the floor, quickly turned his attention to my mother. Did I go against the agreement? Even with Luke, I still left most of the inheritance to Tom. But you? Seeing things were getting worse, I could no longer stand it and shouted, "Enough! Stop arguing! If you want to fight, go outside and do it." They both froze, surprised by my outburst, then fell silent, returning to the tense quiet from when I first entered the house. Once they were quiet, I sat down on the opposite sofa and spoke directly. "I'm breaking off my engagement with Jessica." "No." Before I could even finish, my father immediately rejected my proposal. "That marriage was arranged when you were just a child. You can't cancel it over something as small as this. I don't agree." "You don't disagree?" my mother shot back. "You just want Tom to marry Jessica, take our money, and then let your other son take over." My mother was utterly furious now, pointing at David. "Don't think I don't know. Your other son and Jessica have been secretly working together all this time. I see through both of your plans." "Mom!" I was shocked. She knew everything. So why was she still insisting I marry Jessica? Why did she reject my divorce in the past life, even though she knew all along? My mother, slightly flustered, spoke. "Who you marry doesn't matter. At least Jessica has the ability to help you manage the company. If you find someone better, I'll support you in calling off the engagement." I bitterly smiled. So this was it. None of them truly loved me. I stood up and declared, "I won't cancel my engagement with the Jones family. I'm going to marry Rachel." David seemed about to argue, but stopped when he saw my mother's expression. He reluctantly fell silent. The next day I woke up to see my mother's car parked outside. As soon as I came down, she motioned for me to get in. "Let's go. I'm taking you to the Jones family." The drive was quiet. By the time we arrived at the Jones family estate, Luke had already gotten there before us. Seeing my mother and I enter, Luke proudly wrapped his arm around Jessica's waist, looking at my mother with smug satisfaction. My mother merely glanced at him with disdain, and then immediately got to the point. "We've come here to discuss the marriage contract." Grandma Jones liked me, but because Jessica's mother was now in charge, Grandma's voice had little power in the household. Especially when Jessica heard what we had come for. She immediately grabbed my hand. "You want to break off the engagement with the Jones family?" I pulled my hand back, and before I could respond, Rachel appeared from upstairs, walking over to me and taking my hand. "We're not breaking off the engagement with the Jones family. We're breaking off with you. He's my fiancé now." Jessica glared at our joined hands, her voice shrill with anger. "Why?" I smiled coldly and met her gaze. "Why? Don't you know? Your beloved Luke is perfectly fine and standing right beside you. Shouldn't you be happy?" Jessica's eyes faltered for a moment, before shock took over her expression. She knew I knew, and I knew she knew. But this was our secret, something we both understood, but would never say out loud. Seeing the tension, Grandma Jones sighed. "Tom, we owe you an apology. Don't worry. When you marry Rachel, all the shares under my name will be transferred to you both." I smiled and turned to Grandma Jones. "Thank you, Grandma. I'll have it officially announced by 10 a.m. today." With that, I left the Jones family estate with Rachel. I didn't expect Jessica to chase after us. "Tom, I can explain the reason I did what I did back then." I simply turned and got into Rachel's car, rolling down the window and mockingly glancing at Jessica. "You regretted it back then, so now you should cherish him even more." As soon as my words left my mouth, the car window slowly rolled back up. Rachel squeezed my hand and spoke firmly. "There's no need to say more to her. She doesn't deserve it." "Yeah, you're right." I tightly gripped her hand in mine. We spent the entire day in a villa on the outskirts of the city, enjoying our time together. By the next morning, I packed up and got ready for work. In my previous life, even though I had landed safely, I was still shaken, which caused me to miss out on the City A project. Jessica, on the other hand, had no competition and smoothly secured the City A project. Watching the project double her assets, it was clear to me just how valuable it was. I wasn't about to let that slip by again. While I was working nonstop, Luke came by the office to find me. "Tom, this project is really important to Jessica. Could you not—" "No." I firmly rejected him, as I had in my previous life. I wasn't stupid enough to believe that they had good intentions. If I hadn't threatened Jessica with evidence of her mismanagement and forced her into divorce, she would have tortured me for even longer. But just as we were about to proceed with the divorce, she suddenly changed her mind, stabbing me with a knife and setting fire to the villa. She claimed it was all because of the debt we owed Luke, but in the end, she was the one making the decisions, not me. I didn't want to waste any more time with him and ordered for him to be kicked out of my office. While I was fully focused on securing the project, Jessica didn't give up. She called me non-stop, and as I kept blocking her numbers and finally warned her I would report her to the police if she kept harassing me, she finally fell silent for a while. 2 months later, after my persistent efforts, I successfully secured the City A project. To celebrate, Rachel and I had an impromptu night of passion that lasted until morning. The next day I walked into the office, full of excitement to take the company to new heights. But when I arrived, I saw Jessica standing outside my office, holding a bouquet of flowers. "Tom, I really know I was wrong. Please forgive me." I didn't want to deal with her. I just wanted to get to work. So I sarcastically responded, "If you're sick, go see a doctor. Don't come bother me." As I turned to walk away, Jessica stood up and tried to grab me, but in the process, she accidentally yanked my tie off, revealing the red marks on my neck. "Tom," I snatched the tie from her hand, "you're sick." But Jessica wouldn't let up, her eyes filled with desperation. "Tom, I really regret it. I know I was wrong. If you forgive me, I'll do anything you want." I sneered, lowering my head to look at her, speaking in a tone only the two of us could hear. "What do you regret? Regretting how you treated me in the last life? Don't you know? Late remorse is worth less than dirt." Her face drained of color, her whole body turning pale as she looked at me in shock. I was about to walk past her and head to my office, but she suddenly dashed ahead of me, rushing toward the window. Half her body was leaning out of it, and she screamed, "Tom, if you won't forgive me, I'll jump right now!" I looked at her in disbelief. Before I could respond, Rachel appeared behind me, pulling me toward her and wrapping herself around me. "It's fine. If you jump now, your mother will be thrown out of the house tomorrow." "You?" Jessica stared at Rachel in disbelief, clearly not expecting this kind of blunt threat from someone who had always been so gentle. Fuming, Jessica climbed back inside and gave me one last longing look as she left the building. I didn't care. My marriage to Rachel was moving forward quickly, and there were so many things to plan for.